Welcome everybody, and welcome to all the attendees. We are in this session within the ISQua 37th International Conference, which this year, 2021, is a virtual conference from the International Society for Quality in Healthcare. And in this session, we have the pleasure to discuss the clinical information system and the future of clinical information system, together with our panelists, which I am going to introduce. In this session, we will have Professor Jeffrey Braithwaite from Macquarie University. Professor Jeffrey Braithwaite is the founding director of the Australian Institute of Health Innovation and director of the Centre of Healthcare Resilience and Implementation Science at the Australian Institute of Health Innovation, and professor of Health System Research at the Macquarie University. Then we have the pleasure of hosting Professor Erik Olnagel, which is a senior professor of patient safety at the University of Jönköping, Sweden, and also a visiting fellow of the Institute for Advanced Studies of the Technische Universität München. And then we have third panelist, which is Dr. Giorgio Moretti, which is a founder and chairman of Daedalus Healthcare Systems. And Daedalus is a leading provider of healthcare IT software in Europe and worldwide. And together with our panelists, we would like to enter into this domain and discussion through passing through different questions. And before entering into this discussion, I would like to give to Giorgio Moretti the floor for introducing the session.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. Yes, I tried to share a few slides, very simple. And but it's important to understand why we are here, mainly why we are here. And one of the main point is, do you see?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, yep. That's right. Only the reason because Daedalus is engaged in this session, because Daedalus is a big company now. Is the first company out of the USA in the healthcare IT. But the more important thing is the presence in more than 6,000 hospitals, and with our EMR, we are managing in a lot of countries, from the Australia to UK, France, Italy, Germany, more than 330 million patients per year. This is very important for us, this market presence, and that is important also our vision, and the reason because we accepted to stay in this interesting event. And what is our purpose? Let's go directly to the main point. We need to deliver to our customers product to optimize of course, the operational activities, but this fundamental point is improving the quality of care, the clinical risk control, and also the financial sustainability for the system. This is a very important point. I try to go very fast to in the simple presentation to arrive to define what is the clinical information system versus the electronic medical record. This is the point, and this is the reason because it could be interesting to cooperate with ISQua about the certification process of a few things. You know that the collaboration between the people of the operators, typically doctors and nurses mainly, it is very difficult. There are many constraints, many complexity also in the best of breed of the product in the EMR. And The other very big problem is to share and apply the best practices and the clinical guidelines. This is another very important point. And the actual products that was born probably a few years ago, a few of these a lot of years ago, they didn't consider many fundamental points, and especially in the capability to share the clinical data, to transform the clinical data in clinical knowledge. And there are another point that, especially in Europe, with the introduction of from 25 of May of this year, the CE, the medical device certification of the software, we, honestly speaking, is a disruptive moment that transforms software in another thing. Of course, the pressure in the management of the clinical risk and the optimize the global activities of the organization is the main issue, and is the reason to completely rethink the EMR and to build a new application that consider different paradigmas is more or less this is a simple list, and you see what is the main point: support effective clinical information sharing, that is not so usual, that is not so easy. Reduce the risk of the misinterpretation of the clinical information, and support operational use of best practice and clinical guideline. This is the three main points. And what is the difference between EMR and a clinical information system? And I'm talking about the best of breed in this market. In this moment, what is the EMR? It's a collector of the data. Typically, is a transformation of the paper in digital paper. We manage with the EMR the structured data and the semantic normalization. It is very complicated. And the connection with the clinical guideline protocols, best practice, it is very complicated and is not so usual. And another point is the complexity in the prescription phase, considering the risk assessment and the risk and the risks that we can introduce in that topic phase in the clinical path. What is, in our view, a clinical information system? It's totally different. First of all, because it's a proactive tool to support the clinical practice based on the usability and risk control. This is one of the points of the possible ISQua engagement in the more sophisticated interaction. First, another point is collect, present, and share clinical information and clinical knowledge. It means considering the semantic normalization of the data is mandatory in the possibility to really enter in the new area of the tools, solution, software in the healthcare environment. And also in the other very complex part, the medication and the CPOA, what we call CPOA, is the moment where the doctor prescribe anything, any words that actually from the mouth of the doctor is a prescription. Of course, more or less the complexity is different to respect to what type of prescription, from complex drug, from chemotherapy to the simple lifestyle approach. But anything is important. And you see that also in the clinical data presentation now, the new certification criteria that can move from the CE1, it is very light, to the CE3, when the life of the patient depends from what we are presenting, is a very tough job. And the same is in the clinical data collection. Also in the clinical data collection, you see in the right, in the bottom right, the picture of a tool that we developed, that we are launched that we launched 2 years ago, the CKP, we call the Clinical Knowledge Portal. It's not a portal of data, it's not the contents of data, but the contents of the best practice and the clinical guideline to drive the mechanism to collect, present, and prescribe. This is another story. We haven't enough time to describe what is the whole function, what are the whole functionality of the clinical information system versus an EMR. Also in the prescribing, there are a lot of differences between the traditional prescribing system and the medication and advanced the CPOE. And of course, to arrive to the end, to the clinical knowledge sharing, where the fundamental point is, after that we manage correctly the clinical risk during the for example, inpatient activities, we need to represent correctly in a comprehensible way the information for the benefit for the other professional that will manage the patient in the step 2, 3, 4, 5. This is the main complexity that we want to define, that we define the differences between an electronic medical record and a clinical information system. Clinical information system is a push system, totally normalized in terms of the semantic representation, with a usability that represent a real tool, an asset for the doctors and nurses to control the clinical risk.
Thank you, Giorgio, for this introduction to the to this session. It has been very valuable for us to establish what is happening, beyond the electronic medical record and the establishment of the clinical information system. And you already anticipated some of the main quality of clinical information system, such as proactivity rather than usability, or risk control rather than risk mitigation or management of prescription and therapies. So some very rich attribute of clinical information system. I would like to ask also to Jeffrey and Eric, what are the other possible attributes of clinical information system in order to have a comprehensive definition, also according to their experience, to their research this year and their career. So please, Jeffrey, if you want to start.
Thank you, Alessandro, and thank you, Giorgio, for a wonderful presentation. You encapsulated an awful lot of information in a short presentation. That's a lesson for all of us. Eric, do you mind if I begin?
Please go ahead.
Fantastic, go. So let me say what I heard, Giorgio, first to frame my response. You were saying a lot of words, but the key word I thought was this is an ecosystem. It's a new clinical ecosystem for understanding where the socio-technical comes together, the social, the clinical practice with the technicalities of the system. The Daedalus and other systems that are available are trying to codify. I heard very clearly what you said about trying to, in this period of transition from EMS to a clinical information system, that you were trying to make sure that the quality of care was maintained and improved. Clinical collaboration occurred. It's not just a data problem, it's a collaboration of clinical practice problem. And I heard, although you didn't use this language, essentially what we're doing is we're trying to transform raw numbers into data, into information, into intelligence, so that people have the right information at their fingertips to make decisions at the right time for the benefit of patients. One of the things you were mentioning was to improve clinical practice guidelines and best practice. One issue that we've come up with many of the studies we've done is the notion of 60-30-10, three numbers that are important in healthcare. 60% of care is in line with guidelines on average, although it differs by clinical condition. 30% is the amount of care which is waste or futile care or duplication of tests, all of the stuff that we do but perhaps could do more efficiently or better. And 10% is the estimate of harm, how much of the care that's delivered might be harmful or be representative of a near miss. But of course, you can reverse all of that and say most care is delivered well. The vast majority of care doesn't have harm. And the vast majority of care is not waste. It's good care. So it's a question of whether we focus on is the glass half empty? Is the problem the half empty glass, or is it half full? I would put to you, and the work that Eric has led really across the world for many decades, is that most of clinical care, surprisingly given the complexity, is good care. And what your system is doing is making that even better care. That is really useful. I see your challenges as supporting information sharing, reducing risk, for example, of misinterpretation, as you said, of trying to get best practice or more of it, even though much practice is already good. So my suggestions. One is, what are the barriers to your transition to a new order, a better information system for clinicians and for patients? What are the barriers to making the transition and making the transition well? That's the organizational barriers, if you like. Secondly, what's the bedrock clinical practice? And I think Eric may talk about this, because clinical practice is not often easily codifiable. It has lots of variation. It is resilient. It flexes and adjusts. So how flexible and adjustable is your CIS, your clinical information system, to match the complexities of clinical practice? I see that as a key challenge. Another one is, there's a couple of papers I was reading before I came to this presentation of yours and this discussion on, can we get to the situation where we have continuous certification? So the certification regime matches the flexibility and the adaptability of clinical practice itself. And then finally, I think the most important thing in medicine is first do no harm. Can we guarantee or maintain safety of the patient while we make this transition to a new order of support for clinicians? Those are a few of my thoughts. I hope you found them useful.
Yeah, thank you, Jeffrey, for this rich contribution to the beginning of the session. And yeah, a lot of questions arise already. So hope that Professor Eric would like to enter into some of those, especially those ones relating to organizational barriers for supporting this transition, which is really challenging for this discussion, but also the one more related to variety of therapies and care practices, which is very interesting, and how we could match this heterogeneous landscape of care practices with the certification of tools, of software tools. So would like to give the floor to Professor Eric for this.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm not going to answer all of Jeffrey's questions. I never am. There are too many. But you mentioned, Alessandro, the organizational barriers to this. I would rather turn it around and say, what's the organizational needs? What's the organizational motivation for this? And I think that harks back to what something Giorgio said in the very beginning. The difference between data and information, and by extension, the difference between data and information and knowledge. Because what you need when you treat patients is knowledge and experience of the person who treats the patients, whatever kind of effort they are exerting. And the question is, how can we support that? And I guess that's what the organization is there to do, also to support this, to make sure that people have the skills and the competence that's needed to ensure successful treatment of patients. And I think, coming back to that, we need to be very careful about the distinction, and it is a very important distinction between data and information, because data is, I mean, you just collect data, and these days there's no end to how many data and how much data you can collect and transmit. But data is not the same as information. It's more difficult to say what kind of information do you actually need. I mean, it's easy to answer what data is there and what data can be measured and collected. And I mean, the military 15 years ago went ahead and sort of equipped every soldier, every piece of equipment with sensors, so you could collect data absolutely everywhere. And many of the big international companies do that. Amazon is, again, a good example of that. Do that. They collect enormous amounts of data. So that's not the issue, because if you collect too much data, you simply drown in data. And you have the problem of what's called input information overload, which is a problem that was sort of first described in 1965, I believe, way before the time when we had computers and data networks and so on. People were aware of it. Even in that time, it's too easy to get too much information. And so I think we should be very careful, because what you can do with the electronic medical records, what you can do when you get records going from physical records or paper records to electronic records, is you get access to a lot of data. But I have yet to see a good way of defining how do you get sensible information out of the data, and how, in the end, how do you turn that into knowledge in people's heads? And Jeffrey mentioned the idea, or the problem, the issue of standardization, which I think is really important in this, because it's clear if you can standardize or completely prescribe a situation, this is what needs to be done. This is when it needs to be done, and so on. The more you can specify the actions that are necessary to take, then the easier it is to say, well, this is the data or the information that we need to support these actions. But that also means if you can't specify the actions and if you can't standardize them, then it's very difficult to say exactly what is the information that we need to do that. And I think this is where we have the discussion with the terms that we have been using now for several years, of work as imagined and work as done. So I would say you can define information, perhaps. You can define how you transform data into information from work as imagined. But I defy you to do that for work as done. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Eric, for this comment. And this is very key in this discussion now, since, of course, we are talking about clinical information system that would like or aim to be proactive, supportive, and coordinating also the set of information and practices. So how sensible information came from those systems is a key aspect in the design and the development of technology. I think that we somehow entered already into some of the aspects of the second question we want to address. Since second question was about the main user requirements for clinical information system and how we can meet those requirements to support quality of care and resilience in organization and groups. And so I would like to ask to Giorgio Moretti about continuing this issue about data, information and knowledge, since we are talking about the how clinical information system might differ from the record, from the electronic medical record, and this is a crucial aspect, a distinctive feature of clinical information system. So please, Giorgio.
Eric and Jeffrey touched exactly the point. How many data will we manage, especially in the future? A lot. Entropy. Typically, is entropy of the data. The number of the information that we manage in the future, it will be terabyte, petabyte for each patient probably. It means that the complexity to represent the data and transform the data and information, the clinical knowledge will be the bet. And we call the 6i platform to give the possibility with a backbone to integrate data, ingest data, indexing the data, work inside, inform the right person, intervene for the right person. This is in 1 hour. It's impossible to represent anything, but this is the main bet, the capability to move to much data to evaluate, no clear representation of the data, no simple to understand the significance of the data, too much trivialize the user interface. This is another very important point. It's not enough that we have a system that present to me the right data in the right moment for that specific context, but also the user interface, what we call user experience that you perfectly understand, and also the ergonomic of the user interface is fundamental. And another point, till now we used typically the desktop, the screen, or we use the mobile, the smartphone, but from now there are a lot of devices that we can use to do exactly the right things in the right moment. And another very important point is the low consideration. If the doctors, the nurses perfectly understand what he are seeing in that specific moment or they are doing in that specific moment. This is an example. We define the clinical use case. The clinical use case is the right representation of the data depending from this point. Who is the patient that I have in front of me? What is the problem that I have in this patient? What is the stage of the patient, of the path? In what situation we are working? We call clinical use case. It is completely different. For example, the same problem, an acute myocardial infarction in a suspected phase, in emergency, an emergency doctor, in an ambulance, or in the first aid is a completely different environment. It means that I have different tools, different therapy, different diagnostic equipment to manage the same clinical condition. We call clinical use cases. And a right clinical information system a good clinical information system versus the static EMR must represent the data in the right moment, in the right place, in the right configuration, and depending from this exactly setting. It means that from the static approach to the dynamic approach, this is one point. But we need to add another I in the 6, from the 6 to 7, the concept of the interact to reduce the clinical risk and the fatigue, for example. It means that we must have, we could add a multi-device solution based on the operative use cases. What is operative? Operative, that the same setting could be managed with the different devices in different physical conditions. Stand up, close to the bed, in the trolley, in the medical doctor room, at home. It is completely different. The problem is, could I have the possibility to certify and to manage correctly the operative use case? What am I doing? In which context I'm operating? What is the best device for that context? Why? What is my device now? What is my physical condition? This is the long list of the point. And this is another fundamental transformation from the approach, methodology that we use to produce, to develop an EMR versus produce a clinical information system. It's in a completely different environment where the barrier, Jeffrey, the barrier is the usability. One of the more important things is, till now, company like Daedalus delivered to the market traps, complex objects. Now we need to deliver to the professionals, doctor, nurses, technicians, toys. Let me use these terms. It seems not correct, but it's probably the right definition to simplify dramatically the adoption of this tool. Because if we have simple objects that represent dynamically the right information in the right moment, in the right condition, we simplify the transition from the traditional way to execute the clinical practice to the new way to use this technology to do this job in completely different way.
Thank you, Giorgio, for highlighting the whole experience cycle of both patient and also medical operators and medical staff, and also this emphasis on usability. Of course, as a human-computer interaction expert and researchers and interaction designers, for me it's a kind of perfect soundtrack for this session, in the sense that of course the emphasis on usable tools and how usable interfaces could support and the adoption of informative tools and information systems is another key aspect. And would like to ask Jeffrey for entering into this landscape of very different user requirements that we need to take into account, especially with regards to quality of care.
I'd love to. Thank you, Alessandro. And thank you, Giorgio, for that next presentation of yours, which helps to frame what we are talking about. I'd like to just say two things in response. One is, about 25 years ago, I recall vividly seeing the movie The Hunt for Red October. You may remember that movie. It was Sean Connery, who I think died last year, sadly. And it was about Russian and American submarines tracking each other under the polar ice cap. Very nice movie. And I remember thinking at the time when I watched that movie, people have spent a lot of money on submarines and their capacity for the Russian and American submarines to track each other under the polar ice cap. But I couldn't, in the health systems I was working in, track a patient through the health system from one place to another with their information being available. And I asked myself, why is it the case that we can do a complex problem like track submarines under the polar ice cap and not track a patient and their information across time so that we could treat them with high quality and safely? And the answer is, well, submarines are big and patients aren't very big. There's not very many submarines, but there's a lot of patients. And there's not that many interactions between submarines, but there's a lot of interactions between doctors and clinicians and patients. Almost exponential, as your diagrams were showing, Giorgio. So this is a different kind of problem, but both are socio-technical problems. Both are at the interface of where technology, such as, Giorgio, your information systems, and the clinical care is delivered. But the magnitude of the complexity of the problem in healthcare is much greater. That's one point I want to make. The second point is a dilemma for all systems of this kind, which is how adaptable are the clinical systems? Do we expect the clinical systems to be adaptable to meet the clinical work, or does the clinical work have to adapt to meet the requirements of the system? Now, obviously it's both, but where do you get the right balance between a system that's suitably prescriptive so that people have to do the right thing and deliver high quality care and safe care, but they're flexible enough to meet the flexibility and adaptability and adjustability and variation of clinical work? Where do we get that right? That's my second point. I leave that with you for further discussion. I know Eric's going to pick this up and want to discuss that a little further. Eric, I hope you weren't doing your email, man.
Yeah. No. But you'll receive it soon. No, but actually, I was reminded even before you mentioned the Hunt for Red October about an even earlier event that I think I'm probably not the only one alive who was there. There were other people there, but this is back in the early 80s. This is after 1979, where we had the accident at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant in the US. And one problem that became very clear there was that there was a mess of information. There was too much information. We know the way that the control panels were designed and so on, and operators missed an important piece of information. So there was a lot of concern about information systems and how could you bring, and we just were beginning to get computers into the control rooms. And in those days, these were what we consider huge and today very slow computers, but that was the state of the art at the time. And I was part of some work that was being done, and I worked in Norway at the time, at something called the Halden Reactor Project. And one of the things we were tasked to do was to evaluate a system developed in the US to present information. It was called the Critical Function Monitoring System. And the point was present the essential information to the operators. Just as Giorgio said, this is a problem that has plagued human-computer interactions since the start. Everybody said we need to present the right information in the right form at the right time. But the three rights there, information, form, and time, become more and more difficult to answer as you go along. So anyway, they had developed this wonderful information system, and in particular in nuclear power plants, but in every other system as well. Aircraft now, aircraft cockpits is a good example, and operating rooms as well, is what you call the problem of there are too many alarms. the people are drowning in alarms when something goes wrong. And I remember we were installing this system at the nuclear power plant simulator in Finland. And we talked to the operators and we said, we have this wonderful system that these very clever people from the US have developed, and it's going to reduce the alarms. So you don't get unnecessary alarms. Because so then somebody asked him, how many alarms would you like to have? And one of the operators said, one. He said, the right one. And that's precisely the problem. How do we know which one is the right one? You can filter alarms, but you cannot filter it down to one alarm because the situation is underspecified.
Yeah.
And it will always be the case. And I think that's the dilemma. That's why I sort of going back to where I started before. The difference between data and information is so easy to get data and saturate and oversaturate people with data. But how do you extract what's information there? What they need in the situation? And I don't think there's anyone who has been able to solve that problem. The only way you can solve it is to train people to comply with specific ways of working. That's coming back to what you said about work as imagined, work as done. You can specify information if you have a good description of work as imagined, and if you then force people to work according to work as imagined, you have solved the problem from an information point of view. Unfortunately, you have probably reduced the quality of clinical care considerably and introduced numerous risks in that as well.
Thank you, Eric, for this this walk through different domains and also different situation or cases, such as the 3 Mile Island case. And just wanted to highlight on this need of essential information that you make out at the point, no? So what does it mean, essential information, also in the future of a clinical information system, and how that could be adapted to the use cases, to the clinical case scenarios that Giorgio was talking about. And okay, it seems to me that we all are converging towards this the need of establishing clinical information system as a socio-technical system, as Jeffrey was saying, no, to make this domain inhabited by organizations, groups, individuals, processes, and tools, of course, and software tools. And in this way, come of very important the last of our question, no? How we could make a roadmap to well-designed, validated, and certified software, no? So what are, in your perspective, the first steps for building this process, this formal process where different entities and institutions may cooperate towards this evaluation of quality, this certification of quality Giorgio was talking about? And would like to build, to leverage upon all what we have discussed until now with relation to the interaction among different components of this socio-technical system, and also the need of not overwhelming patient and operators of information and opportunities for interaction, but focusing on their experience, you know, and the situation they are living. So what are the perspective for building this certification according to you? First, Giorgio, and the others.
And first of all, Jeffrey, maybe I watched that movie minimum 100 times.
It is a good movie.
And I'm a doctor, but I spent 20 years of my life in the defense area, and I perfectly understand what you mean. And this is the reason, because the new product must be built with the same concept of the defense, because the clinical activities is a mission critical activities, and many times we forget that, especially in the IT sector, we use the civil approach to produce a solution for the professionals, while the complexity is very close to defense, probably higher respect to what you and especially Eric explained before. Now the point is to represent the right data in the right moment, and considering 2 points, the main pillar, the usability in the risk control. Operative use cases, it means that the point is in which way we can find a solution, no? Because not for Daedalus, but for the market. Daedalus stay in the market. And it's important to understand if it's possible to adopt another approach, more sophisticated, of course, more expensive, more complex, but more reliable, because the point is the reliability of the global chain, combination between professionals, tools, goods, instruments, and so on. In which way we can upgrade the very tough CE medical device certification with a strong attention also to the usability, ergonomics, and so on. This is an example, no? You see, this is one of our map where you can see the representation of the data, and the data are changing depending from many factors. But who can say that this representation in terms of the ergonomic, in terms of the reduction of the fatigue, in terms of the speed, and also to arrive to the same information, clinical information, not clinical data, you arrive more fast, more sure, exactly in the right moment. I believe that we can invent, let me use these terms, invent maybe is too big, is too complicated, but if exists the possibility to attribute a rank in the data presentation, in the acknowledgement system, in the risk control, in the fatigue control, in other words, we can find a way where any information, any interaction with the system is very well analyzed and very well classified. It helps the customers, it helps the market, it helps the patients at the end. And why? Because at the professionals, if we can deliver to the professionals right tools that can use any type of instruments, any type of device, including the decision support system and the new tool from the artificial intelligence that can work in the semantic normalized data, otherwise is nothing, and we can really transform in deep the clinical activities. And I believe that it's another very strong challenge, the possibility to go ahead in this methodology. The methodology is fundamental, tools are fundamental. I believe that if ISQua decide to enter in this arena with an interesting approach, we can first of all build a company that produces these tools that perfectly understand what is the value of these criteria. Secondary point, if an external organization can certify attribute ranks to each specific point that give the guarantee of the best of breed, the real best of breed, Of course, any company will do their job. Any company will compete in the market to produce the best. But there is a way to improve the quality of the solution for the healthcare environment.
Yeah, the improvement of the quality of the care and of the instrument is the core aspect of this session, and the one the core aspect I want to ask for more comments, both Jeffrey and Eric, of course.
Giorgio, I'm very pleased that you saw The Hunt for Red October 100 times. It is a very powerful metaphor for the health system. One thing I must, it wasn't the polar ice caps, but the North Atlantic that they were fighting across and trying to track each other. One of the things about clinical information systems is that it tends to unite the work. Now, that's a very powerful piece of information for anyone who's a certifier. So, you know, in the old world, doctors could have visibility over doctors' work and doctors' notes. Nurses had their own records and their own work and their own culture and their own profession. And allied health were separate again, allied health staff. And one of the things about a clinical information system like yours and the modern breed of clinical information systems is that they unite the work. Now, that's very important because it creates, or it tends to nudge people in the direction of a multidisciplinary team. That was the word collaboration that you used, Giorgio, which I think is very important in this whole area of how are we going to come to grips with and improve quality and safety while we go through this transition. One point I'd like to raise, which is really a question back to you, Giorgio, if I may, and perhaps Alessandro, you want to speak to this. What are we really going to do? This is Eric's original question. What are we going to do with all this information, all this data? You know, in the old world, we'd take a patient history, we'd have some tests, we'd marry that up with some information that we already have available on drugs, patient information, let's call it. Now we've got genomics, medical devices that produce far more calibration of patients. We've got artificial intelligence that we're putting over the top of these systems to help with. How are we going to cope with that? How are we going to reach the answer to your question, which is how are we going to have good certification when we have such orders of complexity coming in the next generation of information that Eric spoke about that needs to be available to provide good patient care? So one paper I was reading leading up to coming here to this discussion was about continuous certification. If clinical work continues to flex and adjust according to circumstances, new treatments come along, the information technology that you've described gets more and more sophisticated, we're going to perhaps need a regime of continuous certification across time, which itself also has to be not just absolute regulation, but continuous flexibility of regulation and certification across time. Otherwise, certification and regulation will be always lagging behind the developments in clinical practice and information technology. So it's a three cornerstone problem, which of course, three body problems are always the hardest to solve because they're all moving at the same time. Eric.
Well, I mean, just to add to your comments on certification, I would like to say this certification certainly solves a problem, but my question is, whose problem does it solve? The problem of the system owner, of the organization that uses the system, of the provider, or does it solve the problem of the people who actually use the system? And I think it's always important to say, well, why have we come into that to say, well, as long as we have certified the system, then everything is fine. But who is it fine for? I think that's important. We have been talking, I've been trying to remember, but Jeffrey, you can probably remember it better than I. But in one of the, dare I say, excellent books on resilient healthcare that we have had the honor and pleasure of editing and publishing. There is one example, and that I've been trying to retrieve it. My memory is failing me, but about the use of clinical information systems, and it's about the nurse that has a clinical information system, in this case, a computer on a sort of a movable table, and she can't take it into the room because where the patient is, because it's a sterile room. So here you have a wonderful clinical information system, and you have maybe even the right information in the right form at the right time, but you can't bring it to the right place. And I think you need to add that, because that will always be a problem. Even if you get smarter devices, there will always be conditions where you cannot use these smarter devices, whatever they are. So I think it's the accessibility of the information once you have it. I think we need to take that into account as well, because if you can't access information, then it doesn't do you any good. Thank you. It
was Deborah De Bono's paper, her chapter in on computer on wheels and doing workarounds, and it is a very evocative example. Eric, that's your memory isn't failing you. That was a very good chapter in one of the books.
Thank you.
Finally, from me, Giorgio and Alessandro, yes, ISQua can be of major assistance in this area. It's got lots of expertise amongst its academicians. Eric's one of those, and its experts and its members in quality and safety, and also people who do lots of work in information technology and clinical information systems too. So we certainly in ISQua can help with some of these questions. And ISQua is very rich, has a very rich tradition of drawing on evidence and studies and expertise. And that is, of course, a major contributor to the really very interesting challenges that we've been posed in this discussion.
Yeah. Thank you both, Eric and Jeffrey and Giorgio, for sure. And I would like to go for the finalization of the session and the concluding remarks. Just a comment from my side. It seems pretty clear that this idea of a certification is leading us not just and not only to a proper situation, proper evaluation situation where you put your remark on the system, but really on a qualified process where different actors could intervene and evaluate these adherence of the system to the practices and to the practices to quality criteria. So it's a very relevant issue emerged from the session, and which also imply the contribution of different actors, not just those external organizations or technical organizations such as accessibility and usability experts, but also technology provider itself with its expertise and knowledge and professional value, and also, of course, the scientific community with the different associations or institutions, dealing with deep knowledge of practices and quality criteria and organizational resilience, and this is a very helpful discussion for building this process. I would like to give the floor to Giorgio for the concluding remarks to this session, and of course to Professor Oldnagel if he has other final comment.
Thank you, Alessandro. Thank you to everybody. It's been, my opinion, a good startup. I totally agree with the continuous certification. It's a social intelligence. It's a global intelligence that continues to certify the utilization of the tool. And of course, it means design and develop a new solution, clinical information system that considering by design this approach. And because of course we need to deliver this kind of information, the result for each user that continuously guarantee the upgrading of the system. But it's important that why it could be interesting the commitment or engagement of organization like ISQua, because we must find the right methodology. Because we can develop in-house, we can define in-house the criteria, but if exists a standardization of the methodology, we can. This approach can help us, can help the industry in this sector to work better and more clever in short time in an arena where the investment are very huge, you know. And thank you for the session that has been very, very interesting, and the pleasure to stay with you.
Thank you, Giorgio. And if there are other comments from our panelists, I will give the floor. Okay. And okay, just last thank you from my side. I was really honored to talk to the three of you, and I also studied on some books from the panelists, so I'm really glad for this opportunity, and really thank you, and hope to meet you again in person, maybe in Florence at Dedalus premise, and also to continue discussing this issue and developing the quality and the improvement of industrial development of clinical information system. So thank you, and bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.